What's up, everyone? I'm super excited to share my thoughts on this subject. Kevin and I have actually touched on this several times, both in and outside of our recorded conversations, and I'm not gonna lie. This was one that had me puzzled for several months. Not necessarily because I didn't understand the church's position, it was more on, like, how could I explain the position? I understand Kevin's issue with the position, but at the same time, something wasn't clicking for me. Well, as Kevin loves to quote, iron sharpens iron, and after talking to him, asking around on different subreddits, I had an insight on this question which revealed the issue and supports something I've said on one of those conversations with Kevin. When a disagreement occurs, what is being disagreed is usually not where it actually takes place. The disagreement is at previous questions that have yet to be responded to. To best approach this topic, I think what will help is to walk through my journey on this. Kevin has expressed, as I mentioned, a concern with what the church calls obsequium religiousum of mind and will, or religious submission of mind and will to her teachings. To sum up his concern, the church obligates us to hold and believe in something that may or may not be true, and effectively can force us to believe something that is under evidenced, and that is not what an institution that's divinely protected or claims to have truth should or would do. Because believing something without great evidence is poor epistemology. This is a valid concern, so in preparation for this video, I did what I did last time. I went to Ask an Atheist and also went to the Debate an Atheist subreddit and asked around, and the responses shocked and confused me. Most of them were not attacking or responding to the question of the submission itself, but on the church having authority in the first place. That they would never submit to the church, that the church didn't deserve their submission. And considering my question was about the submission in and of itself, not necessarily the authority aspect, I was trying to figure out where the disconnect was. Effectively, I was asking, how do I make an omelet? And they were trying to say why they would never be an omnivore. It then hit me. The disagreement is not about the submission of the will, it's about the nature of authority in and of itself. That is why they were attacking the question of authority. Currently, the idea of authority is actually, you know what? I'll let someone wiser than I explain.
Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
As expressed in that clip that everyone should be familiar with, Phineas. The current idea of authority is that it comes from the governed. In other words, authority comes from the act of submitting. I have no authority over you unless you give me authority. The government has no authority unless we as a people give it authority. From this perspective, the obligation of the church seems and is tyrannical. For the church to command authority is no different than...
And you will respect my authority!
But is this the nature of authority? Now, once again, this gets back to the question of if God exists, and for the sake of this discussion, I hope you will grant that a God does exist. If everything comes from God, then that means authority comes from Him as well. The question on abuse of authority is a separate discussion. And there are answers to it. Right now, I just want to focus on authority itself. Now, from this, it follows that the statement from Lumen Gentium, the quote in question, about the religious assent of the will is not a statement demanding we give away freedom, but it is a recognition of the right response of man to right authority. Notice, Lumen Gentium is not commanding that we give a religious assent of the intellect, rather an assent of the will. Now, how does this follow? If man is not the source of authority and is not the one giving authority away in order to submit to that authority he's given, then submission is not how authority is created, per the current understanding. Instead, submission is the response to that authority. In other words, currently our understanding is that submission is what creates authority. The understanding within the church, and for years before America rebelled and you had the founding fathers of America, authority brought about submission. But what about the concern of the church ordering teachings or obligating teachings that are not true? In my studies, most of what I have found is that the first response the church has to a new discovery is not, one must believe in what we say. Rather, it's, hold on, don't get blinded by the new, give it time for the information to be investigated, and then a judgment can be made. An empirical, non-religious example of this is there was an experiment whose initial findings suggested something moving faster than light. And a lot of people jumped on this, excited about it, and were already talking about it as if it was fact and time travel opportunities and things like that. Except for the scientific community. What did they do? They scratched their heads and were like, well, that doesn't make sense with what we know. Let's look a little bit deeper. They eventually discovered that it was an error in one of the wires used in the equipment that created a false reading. What the church is attempting to do is to preserve unity and avoid the sin of scandal within the faithful by its statement. Here's a current example. Pope Francis's most recent outrage is his statement that all religions are paths to God. Now, this sentiment has been expressed by many other bishops, even by Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, so it is not a new teaching or a new expression. But a lot of Catholics viewed this statement as the heresy of indifferentism. Now, the church does recognize that it might ask people to hold on to an idea that will change or even be wrong, specifically for non-infallible teachings, and recognizes that well-learned individuals might recognize it and then be troubled. So the church does permit them to question and challenge those ideas. But how can that be, especially if it's asking for a submission of the will? Well, first of all, unfortunately, most people don't do the deep study that theologians tend to do, as Kevin and I have talked about recently. I'm actually an amateur theologian, but even I would not dare take the title of theologian that the church is using in this document, nor say that I have the wisdom to recognize an error in a church teaching. As such, when the church says, hold on, wait, don't leave the established teaching just yet, I want to make sure that all the information is available. To use a different example, most atheists will say, I am currently not yet convinced of the evidence of a God. And while there is not enough evidence to definitively say there is no God, I will reserve judgment while holding to the atheist identity of lacking belief in the existence of God. Effectively, that's what the church is asking from us. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, I do the required investigation, and I realize that the church is indeed in error. Well, the church permits me to disagree. All she asks is that I don't make a rebellious movement or make a public outcry. The reason being is that in doing so, it might cause confusion and unnecessary stress in others and disunity within the church. This is following the advice of the Apostle Paul. That's what the submission is about. Not about turning off your brain, but understanding that even if you are correct in what you are saying, preserving the unity of the church. And we even see that in our current society. When people disagree with the government, they are able to express their disagreement, but within certain criteria. Here in America, we have freedom of speech, which means we can freely express our disagreement with the government. However, even then, there are still rules, and if you break those rules, you will face the consequences. Following those rules while expressing disagreement with the government is still a submission to the government. So, in conclusion, rather than demanding that we hold to false teachings, what this statement is a recognition of the right response of man to right and just authority. The church permits us to disagree if and only if it is rightly studied and understood. She just asks that we don't sow discord and distress and still have a public display of obedience. Much like how people might disagree with the current president of the United States, but they will still publicly obey the laws in place and express their disagreement in the appropriate ways. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I've got a couple of other ideas on what I want to do next. I think what I'll probably work on next is Anselm's ontological argument. That is one that I have found a lot of fascination with. But feel free to drop any questions, challenges, or concerns within the comments section, and I'll try to get to them as soon as I possibly can.